Hi, I'm the History Guy, and if you didn't know, in addition to our channel here on YouTube, we also have a page on Patreon where for just $3 a month you can support the work we do here at the History Guy. And one of the things that you get for becoming a patron is that one episode a month is made just for our patrons on Patreon, and occasionally we're able to bring one of those episodes to you, the YouTube audience. One of the things that we've done with those episodes are travel logs, where I talk about some of the history that I've discovered in some of my many trips. Well, back in February, I had a severe bout of laryngitis, and so my wife, Ms. History Guy, who co-runs the channel with me and has authored many of the episodes, and you've probably seen in some History Guy episodes, stepped in to do a travelogue of her own where she chronicles her adventures helping a friend move from southern Illinois to Los Angeles. So please enjoy this travelogue where Ms. History Guy and the History Cat chronicle her adventures down historic Route 66.
In October 2019, I had the opportunity to road trip from St. Louis to Los Angeles. We went through rugged vistas, nearly abandoned stretches of historic Route 66, and we passed plenty of places of historical interest that deserve to be remembered. I'm going to share some of those places with you today, as well as some family history of mine that you might find interesting. As you may know from previous videos, the History Guy team is based out of southern Illinois in an area called the Metro East, a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. The history of St. Louis, both the city and the saint whom it was named after, have been discussed in another History Guy video. Lance's family is from further west, but my family has been in this area for generations. Like other immigrant families to the United States, my predecessors came from Poland, Germany, and England seeking opportunities and a new life for themselves and their children. In a family story, one of my relatives came over to establish himself in New York City before sending for his wife and children back in Germany. Before he wrote the necessary letter entreating them to come, his wife died, and the remaining family made the difficult decision to send the 3 children unaccompanied on a boat to the United States. When they arrived in New York, they discovered their father had already remarried, and their new stepmother didn't want to take care of more children, and they were put on an orphan train out of New York City, which, back then, carried parentless children from cities in the east and transported them to farms in the heart of the country. Between 1854 and 1929, historians estimate some 250,000 children were transported and placed with families, just like my relatives. Farmers who needed more help on their properties would take children off the orphan trains, giving them food and shelter in exchange for help on the farms. At the end of their indentured service, the children were given a predetermined amount of money. My great-grandmother and her brother made it to the St. Louis area before she was picked. She had additional siblings who traveled further west to Kansas before they found a family to take them in. The orphan trains eventually ceased operations for a variety of reasons, including the fact that many states began to pass laws regulating the transport of orphans across state lines and requirements for adoption. As I left St. Louis to travel to Los Angeles, I couldn't help but remember my distant relatives who also journeyed westward, imagining how much more frightening it must have been for them, family behind, and an unknown future ahead. Though the route no longer officially exists, my friend and I were traveling further south than my relations, following the historic Route 66 across the country. The length of the route has varied throughout history because of changes and detours made to the official path around major cities, but in 1947 it was approximately 2,278 miles long. The storied road fell out of popularity largely due to President Dwight Eisenhower's Federal Interstate Act, which began the construction of 4-lane interstates to make travel across the country more efficient. The route was officially decommissioned in June 1985, but efforts are currently underway to preserve and restore the highway. And though only a shadow of its former self, I think there are still far too many fascinating stops of historical significance to cover in one trip, but my friend and I certainly tried. Our first stop was the George Washington Carver National Monument, a bit off the beaten path in Diamond, Missouri. Following the signs, we drove about 15 minutes away from the highway and down a 2-lane road to reach the small museum nestled in large trees and with a gorgeous view of the Missouri Plains behind it. His memory of his early years was self-admittedly poor, but Carver was born into slavery. He was kidnapped by slavers as an infant along with his mother and sister, but only Carver was recovered. From a young age, Carver struggled to find educational opportunities because of the color of his skin, but that didn't keep him from walking and relocating to cities where a young black man was welcome. He said, "Education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom to our people." In a letter about his early life, Carver wrote, "From a child I had an inordinate desire for knowledge, and especially music, painting, flowers, and the sciences. The museum's collection includes photos of Carver painting, some of his drawings and handmade crafts like these table decorations made out of lace. And though he is widely remembered as one of the most celebrated black scientists of his time, Carver's early ambitions were to be a painter. His sensitivity to nature served him well when he began to develop methods for improving the yield of southern crops. He was a man of faith and expressed a strong religious conviction even in his scientific studies, believing the two were intimately intertwined. Carver said, "The most beautiful things in life are God's wonderful handiwork expressed through nature." A man ahead of his time, he pioneered finding alternative uses for natural products in order to utilize every piece of material available. For example, he engineered more than 300 different uses for the peanut plant. Richard Pliant, one of the advocates who helped in the effort to create the Carver National Monument, said, "Clearly he has seen how millions starve to death in a world that could live in peace and plenty on what it throws away." Later, as a professor at Tuskegee University, Carver taught his students these virtues that I think are timeless. Be clean, both inside and out. Neither look up to the rich nor down on the poor. Lose, if need be, without squealing. Win without bragging. Always be considerate of women, children, and older people. Be too brave to lie. Be too generous to cheat. Take your share of the world and let others take theirs. Congress and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the bill to create the George Washington Carver National Monument in July 1943. It was the first time an African American man was so honored by the National Park Service. Our next stop was the Oklahoma State Capitol building, which was under renovation when I was there. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as I wandered through the hallways with my friend and made a quick stop in the gift shop to purchase a vintage map of Oklahoma City for the history guy. A point of interest, it is the only Capitol building in the U.S. that features functional oil rigs. One of them is named Petunia No. 1, they say, because it was drilled in a flower bed. Before we left Oklahoma City, we spent some time at the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum. It honors those who were killed, those who survived, and those changed forever in the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building on April 19, 1995. As you walk up to the memorial, you see a fence where visitors to the location continue to leave remembrances and notes for victims of the attack. I passed through the 903 gate, an entrance that represents the minute after the attack, and proceeded onto the grounds of the former federal building. And though it is in the city, it feels as if a hush descends as you enter the space. And within, a reflecting pool with flowing water sits before you, and you face the 901 gate on the far side. To my right sat the field of empty chairs within the foundations of the former building, each chair representing someone who lost their life in the bombing. The heartbreaking detail were the smaller chairs, representing the children who died. The survivor wall within the memorial lists the names of those who made it through the bombing, as well as the survivor tree, a yew which also escaped the destruction, which sits opposite the field of empty chairs. History deserves to be remembered not just for the heights of human achievement, but also those times when humanity commits acts of such atrocity that, as survivors, we can only do our best to ensure that they never happen again. And the National Memorial is one of those sobering places of remembrance and grief. We journeyed on to Amarillo, Texas, known to some as the helium capital of the world for the National Helium Reserve located northwest of the city, yet another topic discussed in a previous History Guy video. I enjoyed a particularly good piece of chocolate cake there. Outside of Amarillo sits a curious monument, Cadillac Ranch, also known as Carhenge, though other spots in the country also bear that moniker. 10 Cadillacs are buried in a row in an open field at an angle that purportedly mimics the angles on the Great Pyramid of Giza. The cars are covered in layers of graffiti and spray paint by visitors, a practice that has been encouraged by the creators of the site in 1974, a group of artists known as the Ant Farm. Though moved from its original location, the field itself belonged to Stanley Marsh III, who used a number 3 in his name instead of the usual Roman numerals because he believed it was, quote, pretentious to do otherwise. Marsh was known for his eccentricity in public stunts, such as turning a field into a giant pool table with its own 100-foot-long cue stick and enormous billiard balls. According to his obituary, which appeared in the New York Times, his prankster legacy was tarnished by sexual abuse scandals later in his life. But Cadillac Ranch still stands, and the artistically minded visitors can add their marks to the monument. I didn't bring any paint myself, but I wish I had. We went on to New Mexico, Arizona, and finally California after that. But those stops will be the subject of further History Guy travelogue videos. I enjoyed seeing people and places on my road trip across the US, but I was reminded that you don't have to go anywhere to learn something new or find history that deserves to be remembered. You can find that in your own hometown, but if you do find the courage to take that step out the door, so many adventures await you. And if you go, maybe I'll see you out there.